Okay, good morning. Good morning, everybody. She's probably. Welcome, everybody. My name is Francisco Monaldi. I am the fellow in Latin American Energy Policy here at the Baker Institute. And on behalf of the Center for Energy Studies, the Mexico Center at the Baker Institute and the Trade Leadership Coalition, we welcome you to this timely event on NAFTA negotiations and North American energy trade. That is very important, of course, for the state of Texas and in particular for the city of Houston as a topic. So energy trade was relatively absent from the original NAFTA agreement in 1994. But since then, of course, in the last quarter of a century, the North American energy landscape has dramatically changed. Of course, the U.S. shale revolution, which Texas is a very important part, has been a very significant catalyst of that change. The boom in the Alberta oil sands, but also the tremendous interconnectedness between the three countries that belong to NAFTA. And more recently, of course, the energy reform in Mexico has been a very major development, opening up to the private sector their electricity, natural gas, and oil sectors. So now we have in a world of a lot of abundance in energy in Latin America, in North America, and so that is something that is quite different from the scenario that we were in 1994. And as you know, currently we are in the process of a renegotiation of the NAFTA agreement, and thus we thought that it was really important to understand how is the renegotiation going and what will be the implications for the energy sector and, of course, for our city and our state. So for that, we have a terrific group of experts. We have Karen Antebi giving the keynote. She's the economic counselor for the Trade and NAFTA office at the Embassy of Mexico in Washington, D.C. And she will tell us about the latest developments in the ongoing negotiations, including the potential provisions for the energy sector. And then we will have she will give the keynote, and then we will move on to a panel in which she also will participate, and we will have short presentations by Aaron Annavel, the energy counselor of the Embassy of Canada in Washington, Marianne Brown, the vice president of federal government affairs of Sempra Energy, one of the very significant investor in Mexico, and Adrian Duhalt, who is a postdoctoral fellow here at the Baker Institute, specializing on energy in Mexico. So with that, I give you Karen Antebi with her presentation, and then we will move on. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Oh, kind of bright up here. Good morning. Good morning, all. Welcome, and a special thanks to the Baker Institute and to the Trade Leadership Coalition for organizing this very important event. I am honored to be here today to speak about the importance of NAFTA for Mexico, for our region as a whole, and for the energy sector in particular. We have a saying among the original NAFTA negotiating team, and that is that without Texas, there would be no NAFTA. We appreciate and value the Texas demonstrated leadership, commitment, and friendship. So today, before I begin, I would like to recognize the historic contribution of prominent Texans like Presidents George H.W. Bush, President George W. Bush, all governors from Ann Richards to Governor Greg Abbott, and of course, Secretary Baker, for strongly promoting closer bilateral relations and U.S.-Mexico trade. Throughout history, global trade has been an engine of economic growth, security, and prosperity. Trade drives competition and innovation. It provides jobs and improves the quality of lives of hundreds of thousands of people that work in small, medium, and large enterprises. As some of you may know, Mexico shifted away from a closed import substitution model for growth and development only 3 decades ago. In 1986, we joined the GATT, but it was really the entry into force of NAFTA that truly marked a turning point. Since then, the agreement anchored Mexico's commitment to sound macroeconomic policies, fiscal discipline, and free trade. Today, Mexico is the 15th largest economy in the world, and the $830 billion in trade represents about 78% of our GDP. We are the 8th largest importer in the world, and with total exports exceeding $400 billion, we also rank as the 8th largest exporter worldwide. Mexico ranks among the top 5 destinations for FDI among emerging economies. As you probably know, the United States is our number 1 source of FDI, accounting for 46%, and Mexican investment in the United States has quadrupled since 2005. Currently, Mexican companies have invested in over 6,500 companies across the United States, and together they export more than $1 billion a year to global markets. As I said, I believe that NAFTA was the most ambitious free trade agreement of its time. It became the model for trade negotiations to follow and unleashed an unprecedented era of economic expansion across the globe. But personally, I feel that the agreement has contributed to Mexico's transformation on at least 3 fronts. First, it modernized Mexico's production capacity. It demonstrated to Mexicans and to the rest of the world that we can compete and compete successfully in world markets. Second, it transformed our relationship with the United States, from distant neighbors to strategic partners for prosperity. And third, it contributed to building transparent and accountable institutions. The free flow of goods also brought the free flow of ideas. It empowered civil society and helped usher a new democratic era. Since NAFTA entered into force in 1994, North America has grown to become one of the most robust and integrated regions in the world, accounting for 18% of world exports and 17% of service trade. Trilateral trade has tripled to exceed over $1 trillion, and 14 million jobs in the United States depend on this partnership. Now, despite all the noise, U.S.-Mexico trade is at an all-time high and continues to expand. In the last quarter of a century, bilateral trade has multiplied by a factor of 7 to reach $557 billion last year. We trade over $1 million a minute, and these hundreds of billions in trade support over 5 million jobs in the United States and many more in Mexico. Among the 50 states of the Union, Texas is the most important trading partner, and Mexico is Texas' most important foreign market. There are 48 border crossings between the United States and Mexico, 29 in Texas. Last year, $364 billion, or 65% of our total bilateral trade, passed through Texas. In the Lone Star State, at least 400,000 jobs depend on this very vibrant relationship. Mexico is the United States' second largest export market, but did you know that we are poised to become your number 1 in the next 5 years? The $243 billion in U.S. exports to Mexico last year nearly doubled those of the previous decade, and they represent about 16% of U.S. sales worldwide. Last year, U.S. exports to Mexico were larger than the combined U.S. exports to the BRIC countries, to the 4 export markets in the European Union, or the Asian tigers, and they are obviously nearly double those to China. Likewise, Mexico is the second largest foreign supplier to the United States. Undoubtedly, the certainty of market access under NAFTA has strengthened supply chains across North America, from the Yukon to the Yucatan. This is important because for every dollar that Mexico exports, the U.S. exports too. On average, 40% of the content in U.S. goods exported by Mexico is U.S. made. That is 10 times more than the U.S. content in Chinese exports. This means that U.S. producers gain about 40 cents out of every dollar spent on Mexican products worldwide. Production sharing is a major part of the U.S.-Mexico trade relationship. 40% of our trade is intra-industry, and U.S.-sourced materials make up more than half of the value of all Mexican exports in highly integrated sectors. There may have been a time when the value chains created by the agreement were considered just a profitable byproduct resulting from good neighborly relations that enabled our shared industries to flourish. Today, they are key to our economic success. They make production more efficient, labor more valuable, jobs more abundant, and they ensure that North American companies remain competitive globally. The U.S. auto industry is a shining example. NAFTA is responsible for strengthening value chains that enable North America to remain a global powerhouse in automobile production, as well as a premier destination for foreign manufacturers. Since NAFTA, auto manufacturing in the United States has increased by more than 1 million vehicles annually. It is estimated that parts and components cross the border of the NAFTA countries up to 8 times before final assembly. In global vehicle production, US, Mexico, and Canada rank among the top 10. Electronics is another example of how NAFTA's value chains have been beneficial to US companies and job growth. Just like auto manufacturing, North America's supply chains are critical to the industry's global competitiveness. The US and Mexico trade over $146 billion in electric and electronic equipment annually. Here in Texas, for example, computers and electronic products are the state's largest export product, not only to Mexico, but worldwide. And Texas exports about $47 billion in computer and electronic products. More than half of that goes to Mexico. NAFTA enables enterprises to leverage comparative advantages in terms of geography, capital, labor, and technology. It fosters a virtuous cycle where enterprises invest to produce for the region and world markets. They create more and better paid jobs across the region and provide consumers with a broader selection of higher quality products at competitive prices. There is no better example of our economic and strategic success than the experience of our energy industries. NAFTA set the stage for North American energy market integration and changed our collective energy destiny. 2 facts make this statement unassailably true. Canada is the United States' largest energy supplier, and Mexico is the largest energy consumer. The U.S. Energy Information Administration recently determined that the amount of petroleum and other liquid energy sources produced by the United States, Canada, and Mexico will soon be greater than the amount we consume. In other words, North America is poised to become energy self-sufficient as soon as 2020. This phenomenal achievement adds significantly to our collective security. It is a testament to the success of NAFTA in integrating markets and to the energy industry for applying innovation and capital to solve our most pressing problems. Mexico's role in the North American energy market is both as an importer and exporter. For the last 3 years, the United States has had an energy trade surplus with Mexico. An important part of this trade is natural gas. Today, Mexico is a top destination for U.S. natural gas exports, both pipeline and LNG. 90% of Mexico's natural gas imports are sourced from the United States. In 2017, Mexico purchased about half of the United States' total natural gas exports. Interestingly, last year was the first time in 60 years that the United States registered as a net exporter of natural gas. Mexico is already the United States' best customer, and we're poised to purchase more. Demand for natural gas in Mexico is expected to grow by 30% over the next decade. In 2018, natural gas export capacity from the United States to Mexico is expected to double. This will help alleviate the natural gas glut. Texas has especially benefited from our demand for natural gas. In 2017, 4 U.S. pipeline projects were under construction, totaling 3.5 billion cubic feet per day. They supply gas to plants in the states of Chihuahua, Nuevo León, Sonora, and Sinaloa. And by the end of this year, 2 additional plants, totaling 3.3 billion cubic feet per day, are projected to be exporting natural gas to Mexico's northeast and central regions, mainly from eager for play in southern Texas. Our bilateral relationship in crude oil and refined products is also highly symbiotic and successful. Last year, Mexico was the source of 8% of U.S. crude oil imports, ranking 4th behind Canada, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. U.S. refineries purchase crude from Mexico to turn it into refined products and then export it back to Mexico. Last year, Mexico imported more than 1 million barrels per day of U.S. petroleum products, and U.S. gasoline exports now make up half of Mexico's gasoline consumption. One of our goals in the NAFTA negotiations is to maintain and expand this mutually beneficial and robust energy relationship. The application of new technologies in the extraction of energy resources, like shale, coupled with landmark reforms undertaken by the Peña Nieto administration, make updating the NAFTA ever more relevant. Competition today is driven by regions. When NAFTA was negotiated, there were approximately 50 regional agreements registered under the World Trade Organization. Today, there are over 250, and more than 50% of world trade is conducted through these arrangements. Before I get into the state of play of the negotiations, I would like to set the stage for what Mexico considers a successful agreement. In order for the agreement to be successful, it must meet the following criteria. First, it must strengthen North America's competitiveness. Second, it should foster a more inclusive regional trade, so the gains reach more regions, more sectors, and more people. Third, it should leverage the 21st century economy, one that is clearly driven by digital flows and energy efficiencies. And last, but certainly not least, it should provide a framework that gives certainty for trade and investment across the region. So where are we? After 8 months of negotiation and 7 full rounds, we are pregnant and fully showing. Officially, we've closed 6 chapters and 4 technical annexes since the conclusion of the Mexican round at the end of March. Our technical negotiators have been working nonstop, literally nonstop. There's a second package of deliverables that is ready to close and critical to North America's competitiveness. This includes financial services, competitiveness, environment, telecom, SOEs, digital, and most importantly here today, energy. Let me give you some comments about the status of the energy discussions in the context of the current negotiations. As some of you may know, we've undertaken what we call a hybrid approach to the negotiation of this sector. This means that provisions that are relevant but cross-cutting are included in other chapters, such as market access in goods, services, investment, temporary entry, SOEs, etc. However, those that are specific to the sector are being addressed in a designated technical group. In the end, we envision that there will be a new energy chapter in NAFTA 2.0, keeping the structure of NAFTA 1, but sending the message that the transformation of this sector in the last quarter of a century requires a new approach. In the course of the negotiations, all 3 countries have contributed to building a consolidated text for the energy chapter, and we are advancing in key issues such as investment and non-conforming measures to cross-border trade and services, which will reflect the result of Mexico's recent constitutional reform. Expansion of market access in the group of temporary entry of business people, and disciplines for SOEs, government procurement, and dispute settlement. Throughout the entire negotiation, Mexico has sought to be creative and constructive, yet difficulties remain in areas that are deemed a priority for the U.S. administration. mainly the trade deficit and the America First agenda. Specifically, automotive rules of origin and dispute settlement mechanisms have been subject to extensive discussions. At the same time, we have clearly laid out our red lines, which include a sudden death clause in the Sunset Review and the seasonality provision for agricultural products in anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations, which clearly targets Mexican agricultural producers to the detriment of consumers across North America. The sudden death clause in the sunset provision runs counter to our objective of providing a framework for economic actors to have the certainty and transparency needed to make those long-term commitments and partnerships. This would be particularly destabilizing for investments and the growth in the energy sector, among others. Moreover, it seems that some of the U.S. proposals run counter to U.S. interests. Among these, or we label them as poison pills, are severe restrictions in government procurement and the proposal to eliminate the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism. It seems to me that this issue is particularly important to folks here today. ISDS has been an instrument in promoting the development of critical infrastructure that facilitates energy trade. As I mentioned, Mexico is the United States' most important energy market, and reforms to our energy sector offer even greater opportunities for U.S. firms and others to invest. This negotiation offers also an opportunity to lock in the market access allowed by the Mexican constitutional reform. This, coupled with strong dispute settlement mechanisms, can lay the groundwork for decades of additional energy market integration across North America. So in the last few weeks, there's been a lot of rumble regarding deadlines. Let me be clear. While we're fully engaged, it is the substance that drives the negotiation, and not the other way around, not the times. To crack the negotiation, we need signs of flexibility from the United States. Mexico cannot make concessions on tough issues if there is no balance. While there's stakeholders in all three countries that do agree on the substance of many important issues, what must be decided is which vision of global trade will win out in the end. Is it one that seeks to grow the pie, enhance our cross-border commerce, and facilitate greater joint production and market integration? Or is it one that seeks to split the pie, a vision of zero-sum trade, and us versus them mentality, where I fear the only winners will be our overseas competitors? We all know that it is hard to explain the benefits of trade in a bumper sticker, and governments cannot do this alone. Business, farmers, consumers, academia, and civil society is needed to tell the full story. Personal stories about the importance of trade and the agreement need to reach the administration. As I mentioned, NAFTA transformed and redefined the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. In the past quarter of a century, the agreement has become the backbone of our partnership. Mexico and the United States cooperated on issues well beyond trade. Because we are neighbors, our security, our prosperity, and our safety are, and forever will be, inextricably linked. There's no relationship that is more important. We are your first line of defense. In conclusion, trade is not zero-sum, and the sum is greater than the parts. A successful conclusion of NAFTA 2.0 will unlock great potential and contribute to ensuring that North America remains amongst the most competitive regions in the world. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
So now, please, the panelists, can you please move on to the... So we will have at the end time to for questions, including for Karen. But now we will have time to... So now we will have our three panelists. First, we'll start with Aaron Annable, the energy counselor from the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C. By the way, you have in the program the CVs of all our speakers today. Then we will have Marian Brown, Vice President of Federal Governmental Affairs for Sempra Energy, which, as I mentioned, is a very significant player in the natural gas and electricity sectors in Mexico. And Adrián Duhalt, our postdoctoral fellow in Mexico Energy Studies here at the Baker Institute. So each of them will have between 7 and 10 minutes, and then we will have some moderated discussion, and then we will open up for questions from you. So Aaron, please.
Good morning, everyone. So can I just say what Karen said? No, seriously, thank you very much, Karen. It was a great overview, and I think you really did cover, from what I understand, where things are, and certainly reflected the importance of this relationship and how far it's come since NAFTA first entered into force. So I'm going to keep it pretty short. Again, obviously, I want to try avoiding repeating what the areas that Karen has covered, but I'll probably stick more closely to just sort of energy-related aspects, and try and lay out some of what Canada's thinking is around energy in the NAFTA and beyond in sort of North America more widely. So I think generally we believe that a fair agreement that benefits all three NAFTA partners is possible, and our negotiators are working tirelessly to achieve this. Negotiations remain intensive, and all sides are working hard to move issues forward. While a considerable amount of work remains, Canada is committed to finding win-win-win solutions that create jobs in North America and contribute to our competitiveness as a continent. We believe that a balanced agreement is possible, but this will require a willingness on all sides to address each country's priorities in the negotiations. So in terms of energy objectives for Canada in the NAFTA, we consider the North American energy relationship to be a model for the world. And we continue to believe that deeper integration can achieve an even more stable and secure energy system and continental energy independence. While NAFTA is responsible for success stories across numerous sectors, energy in particular stands out as an area where a modernized NAFTA could bring more benefits and a win-win-win outcome. We have 4 key objectives for energy in NAFTA. That would be to preserve those existing provisions in the chapter that continue to be commercially meaningful, to address market access opportunities and commercial irritants, to provide for enhanced cooperation and coordination on energy issues, and to demonstrate the economic importance of the sector and ensure NAFTA supports continued growth and enhanced North American competitiveness. We're seeking outcomes that safeguard and promote Canadian energy interests, that enhance cooperation and coordination on energy issues across North America, and that bring Mexico in as a full partner. These include removing barriers to energy development, including on cross-border infrastructure, building and strengthening energy security, supporting the transition to a low-carbon economy, formalizing Mexican energy liberalization reforms and protecting investors, and finally, enhancing cooperation on energy regulation. Discussions have progressed well, and I think Karen noted that on energy it is definitely moving in a very positive direction, and we see that an energy chapter could be realized within the timelines that support an overall push for a conclusion. More widely, the importance of NAFTA to North American energy integration, this is an energy relationship that's grown exponentially under the NAFTA. The free flow of energy products across our borders, including oil, gas, and electricity, as well as services and technologies, is integral to securing an affordable, reliable, and abundant access to energy supplies that fuel our industries, power our transportation, and heat our homes. The NAFTA modernization is an opportunity to better align the agreement to modern economic context, to foster North American economic growth, energy security, and environmental protection, as well as the global competitiveness of our businesses. I think there's also some geopolitical advantages to this relationship. The strength of this North American integrated energy market not only contributes to the continent's security, but can also contribute more widely to global energy security and diversity. Our geopolitical positions are stronger through the integration of this sector than they would otherwise be, given the enhanced energy security, independence, and export powers that our relationship provides. Right now, there are huge private sector opportunities opening up in Mexico as that country's energy reforms continue to unfold. NAFTA provides North American companies with a predictable investment framework to take advantage of these opportunities. Without the agreement's investment protection, they may hesitate, leaving a void that will be filled from companies outside of the region, perhaps from Russia and China. So the importance of the North American energy integration to U.S. Security and economic competitiveness is worth noting as well. As the NAFTA process continues to unfold, I think one thing is certain: Canada is probably going to remain America's #1 supplier of all forms of imported energy. We are currently the largest supplier of imported oil, gas, electricity, and uranium. Energy from Canada fuels U.S. competitiveness in manufacturing and supports hundreds and thousands of American jobs. Our crude oil provides a secure and dependable supply to U.S. refineries in the Midwest and here in the Gulf at a time when growing instability and insecurity among other foreign crude suppliers exists. And this, I only have one slide today, but I think this is sort of a good illustration of the success story that's taken place for our oil sector. These two lines represent where U.S. imports from Canada of crude oil have gone since 2000. And this is in relation to total exports of U.S. exports of petroleum products, which come to Canada and also around the world. And this has happened as Canada's oil sands have developed. And I know there is a lot of focus among the administration to trade deficits, and yes, there is a trade deficit on the crude front from Canada, but this is the argument that we like to make. This deficit, this is supporting U.S. refineries and what they're producing to export to the rest of the world. And you see with these two lines where they've gotten to now in 2016. And not only for U.S. petroleum products, but Canadian Energy also supplies U.S. manufacturers and provides them with secure, reliable, and affordable energy they need to keep costs down. So I think it was Secretary Ross that a few months ago referred to this deficit as a blameless one. I think it's also worth noting some of the examples of North American energy collaboration that exists alongside the NAFTA. It's actually filled with examples about how we collaborate both inside and outside the governments. So in November, the 3 North American energy ministers met in Houston. And by the way, the 3 they aren't the NAFTA leads, but our 3 energy ministers have a very close relationship. In Houston, they discussed areas where we can build on our energy collaboration. And they also formally launched the Trilateral North American Energy Information website. And this has been a project that's sort of developed over several years. I think it started in 2014, where all of our energy data, government groups worked to harmonize our data to present sort of a unified data set that would be more useful to market analysts and those who are interested in this information. So we actually have this trilateral website that we all feed data into, and it has a great interactive map that actually, I mean, it really illustrates the massive energy relationship that exists across the continent. So that's been a very positive aspect. I would say in terms of NAFTA, one thing that's notable is that our 3 respective petroleum industry organizations have come out with joint positions on the negotiations, given that their interests are so aligned. And of course, innovation has always been at the heart of our respective energy sectors development. It's what enabled the development of the oil sands, just as it has in the Permian. And it's also what's spurring clean technology development in all three countries. Next generation biofuels, in advanced batteries for electric vehicles, and in other areas where we need to continue collaborating on our future energy as our future energy mix continues to evolve. I was lucky enough to be here in Houston last year at CERAWeek for Prime Minister Trudeau's keynote. He was the foreign keynote leader last year. And he said that innovating and pursuing renewables isn't somehow in competition with more traditional resources. It's common sense. So I think all three countries recognize this, and we know that we have to balance environmental protection with resource development. I don't want to take up too much more time because we're going to hear from two other speakers, but I think a NAFTA withdrawal would place our energy security at risk, and it would undermine North American energy independence. And all of this at a time of growing instability and insecurity in non-North American sources of supply. So the bottom line, I think, is that North American energy integration is a NAFTA success story, and it's enhanced the competitiveness of all three countries. Competitiveness that depends on access to secure, reliable, and affordable energy that the agreement has fostered. So thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Aaron. Now we'll have Marian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisco. I want to thank the Baker Institute for hosting this event. The Baker Institute is one of the most prominent think tanks in the world, especially in the space of energy, and I think it's wonderful that you all are hosting this event on NAFTA, in particular with a focus on energy. I was asked to join this panel to bring a perspective of business, and in particular, energy business. So Sempra Energy is a San Diego-based energy company, and I run our Washington office. Our approximate 20,000 employees serve more than 40 million consumers worldwide. We're in business in the United States, Mexico, Chile, and Peru. In Mexico, our subsidiary IEnova is one of the largest energy companies in Mexico, and I'll go into some of the details on that in my remarks. To go specifically to NAFTA and energy, I think it's important to take a step back, and I think these points were made by Aaron and Karen, but energy is a major U.S. success story of the last decade, and there's no audience that knows that better than this one. But as you also know, it's larger than the United States. It really is a North American energy renaissance that we have been enjoying. And indeed, the Baker Institute has been so wonderful documenting this, and it's a lot of the policy ideas from the Baker Institute that have helped to make this renaissance a reality. As a result, the center of gravity on energy has moved from the Middle East to the middle of Texas, and the benefits could run from Canada all the way down to Chile. But in our mind, in order for that to happen, it starts with a strong NAFTA. North American energy integration, as Aaron said, is over the last 20 years is a NAFTA success story. And this integration has been good for energy security. It's been important for North American consumers, and it's been very important for the economies of all three countries. U.S. trade between Canada and Mexico is approximately $140 billion. And the U.S. enjoys a surplus in energy trade with Mexico of more than $11 billion. And there is a great potential for this figure to grow. It is our view, and I think the energy business sector shares this view, that NAFTA can and should be modernized, but it needs to be done in a smart way. Sempra speaks from a lot of experience in this area. Because of NAFTA, our Mexican subsidiary, IEnova, is the largest energy company in Mexico, second to Pemex and CFE. IEnova owns natural gas transmission, distribution, generation, and storage. We are also in the renewable generation business and the petroleum product storage business. As of 2017, we had invested $8 billion. We will have invested $8 billion in Mexico. And these investments create U.S. jobs, good U.S. jobs, by building a market for U.S. exports. IEnova's infrastructure in Mexico, natural gas infrastructure, connects to 11 U.S. natural gas cross-border pipelines. We are building large petroleum product storage facilities in Mexico to store 4 million barrels of U.S. petroleum products. and the projects that we build in Mexico, 1 billion of the supplies for those projects come from the United States. And when I'm talking about that, I'm talking about valves, compressors, pipelines, steel. Investment like ours helps support natural gas imports into Mexico, which accounts for 60% of the gas exports that the U.S. exports. This is 4.3 BCF a day for the many energy folks in this room, a lot of that coming from Texas. And at 849,000 barrels a day, Mexico is the largest export destination for U.S. petroleum products. These figures help make one very important point. The energy value chain between the U.S. and Mexico, and I think the case is very much the same with Canada, is wide and deep, and it has the potential to be much stronger. For these reasons, Sempra testified last year to the Committee on Ways and Means, which is the primary committee that has jurisdiction over trade in the House of Representatives, and made several very specific points. The first recommendation we made, and very heartened to hear the positive progress that's been made in this space, but the first recommendation that we made was urging that the text of NAFTA be amended to lock in the current state of openness in energy markets in the three countries. The second proposal that we made was that NAFTA's investment protections be expanded to include investment agreements consistent with other U.S. trade agreements. These are the agreements that investors have with the government, which are very common in the energy sector. Third, and it's been already a major discussion point today, we urge that the Investor State Dispute Resolution, ISDS, that it be maintained, as it is crucial for supporting the long-term investments that are required for the types of energy investments that Sempra makes. And lastly, we encouraged increasing regulatory coordination, particularly to promote cross-border infrastructure. I think through Keystone XL, we learned a lot about the need for certainty and transparency in that process, and NAFTA presents us an opportunity to be able to provide that clarity. These kinds of reforms will give us an even more powerful NAFTA, and a stronger NAFTA will advance the administration's goals around energy dominance, increasing energy exports from the United States to other countries. However, we are very concerned about the U.S. proposals in the NAFTA renegotiation. Rather than modernizing NAFTA, we view these proposals as weakening the agreement. In particular, I would focus on two policies. The first is reducing investment protections and limiting access to ISDS. And the second is the proposal that would terminate the agreement every 5 years unless affirmatively renewed. I think Karen referred to it as the sudden death provision, which I like that. I'm going to take that. These investments are not in the interests of U.S. energy companies, and it's going to force companies to think twice about the long-term, multi-billion-dollar investments that we make when we make energy infrastructure investments. And a point that I want to make is the business community has been very clear with the administration about these concerns. And trade agreements are different from other government-to-government agreements in that they set the rules for business to be able to operate, making business an implied party. And without business buy-in, that they will invest on the terms and conditions that are being agreed to, I think we would say that the agreement doesn't have value. And that's why the business stakeholders' perspective is especially important in a trade agreement. If investment lags, U.S. energy exports, this wonderful story that we've been talking about today, it will not continue to grow at the current rate. And Mexico will be incentivized to look elsewhere for their energy supplies and for their partner of choice, like China. And we've seen this happen. Sempra has invested in other areas in Latin America. We've seen this happen in other parts of Latin America. And once these investments are made by other foreign investors, then we're locked out for 20 to 30 years because that's how long these investments last. None of these are outcomes that anybody wants, and it's in no party's interest. It's why we continue to emphasize the enormous benefit that NAFTA has been to the U.S. energy industry. If negotiators can preserve the many benefits and find consensus to modernize and improve the agreement, North America will be even more integrated and a powerful energy market for years to come, and this will benefit U.S. workers, the economy, and the environment. And that's our hope, ultimately, on where we end up.
Thank you. Adrian.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the excellent overview given by the panelists, especially Karen. And okay, well, I am here at the Baker doing a postdoc, and the main research I'm doing is related to natural gas and energy trade between Mexico and the U.S. And that's what I want to talk about it, and also about political uncertainty, surrounding NAFTA negotiations, but also what's going on in the case of Mexico. And well, since the beginning of NAFTA negotiations in August 2017, we keep wondering what shape the NAFTA is going to have in the end. On the on this side, for example, with that respect, last weekend, the Summit of the Americas came to an end, and Vice President Mike Pence, after talking to President Enrique Peña Nieto and Prime Minister of Canada, he was quite positive with respect to the future of NAFTA. He even said that we may have a NAFTA within the next several weeks, but that statement came after, a kind of controversial statement by Mr. President Trump saying that, we can carry on negotiations with NAFTA. We are in no rush. And because in that way, companies are holding investments, multi-billion dollar investments in Mexico. And that is the kind of, political uncertainty surrounded by the NAFTA negotiations. And in the case of Mexico, something similar is happening because we are facing elections in July the 1st, and we have the leading contender for the position saying that he's going to review the oil and gas contracts, but at the same time we have his main economic and political advisor saying that the instrumentation of the energy reform is going to continue. I mean, whoever becomes president, it will be a mistake to harm the implementation of the energy reform, and that is that's my same. But that's the same. And I have a similar opinion with respect to NAFTA. I mean, terminating NAFTA will be a mistake because it provides the institutional scaffolding for markets to be more integrated, for North America to be more competitive. So, and now with respect to natural gas, I think that illustrates the relationship that Mexico and the U.S. is building. It's actually what is going on here in Texas, for example, with respect to production of shale gas and the abundant supply and at competitive prices, is having policy repercussions in Mexico. Actually, as Mexico is trying to put in place a natural gas market, by creating all these institutions and advancing all these policies to create different mechanisms to have a more competitive market, Mexican policymakers are thinking of what's going on in Texas in particular, in the U.S. in general, because what they want is to take advantage of the shale revolution happening here in the U.S. And that relationship, for example, illustrate how interconnected both markets are. Without Mexican demand, we wouldn't be seeing, the prices we are seeing here in the U.S. I mean, there is a lot of natural gas here in the U.S., and the natural market for that production or that additional production is Mexico. And for Mexico, it's important to have access to the U.S. natural gas because it's becoming, it's actually the main fuel in the energy matrix, in the energy mix in Mexico. By having access to cheap natural gas in the U.S., what Mexico is doing is providing more competitive tariffs to users, and including manufacturing. So, and I think, the infrastructure being put in place along the border, is increasing. So today, well, I think she was talking about, the different pipelines being laid down along the border, and by the end of 2018, we are going to have, the capacity to transport natural gas along the border will be double the capacity we used to have in 2016. So in a matter of 2 years, Mexico and the U.S. are building more and more capacity to transport natural gas along the border, and that's important. And for this and many of the other reasons here exposed, I think it's important to have this kind of conversation here at the Baker.
Thank you, Adrian. So I wanted to start with talking a little bit about sort of where we were before and how we moved. But I wanted, before my economist side cannot let me make go on without making a conceptual point and sort of hear your comment from it, which is, first of all, bilateral trade is not a measure the deficit. Bilateral deficits are not a measure of success of anything, right? I have, a surplus with Rice University, but I have a deficit with my barber, with my grocery store, with my kids' school, and I don't want to, go and lecture in my kids' school in order to have a balanced trade with them. I don't want to, go and lecture my barber in order to get the same result. I specialize on something. I'm pretty good. I'm just good at one thing. I don't know how to do anything else. And the point being that bilateral trade is not, is not a relevant. Bilateral deficits are not a relevant measure of, what you want to accomplish, right? Moreover, at least from my macro, lectures a long time ago, as far as I remember, if you are looking at overall trade deficits, one of the main sources of that is if you have a significant fiscal deficit and you have to finance it with money coming from abroad, you will have a big trade deficit. That's, it's a matter of an identity in economics. There is no way around it. So if you want to solve your trade deficit, you will have to either increase your savings domestically or have less fiscal deficits. So my point is, are we focusing on the right things here? I know it's a heated political debate, but what should we be focusing on? Anyone? Yeah, go ahead, Karen.
I couldn't agree more violently with you. So when I speak about the deficit and I share his views, I also say per capita, Mexico buys twice as much from the United States than the United States from Mexico. Huh. And as I said earlier in my presentation, there's a 40% U.S. content in Mexican final exports and about a 25% Canadian U.S. export in final Canadian exports. So if we were just to, I say, if we really just want to address it in terms of bilaterally, Mexico would have to go to fertility rates of the 1960s, where women were having about 10 children, and we would be able to maintain that pattern of consumption, or really focus on what we're trying to do, which is build a stronger North America that can export more to world markets, because 90+% of world consumers are outside of North America. So for us, the key is really to focus on what's going to make North America more competitive. And as you all shared your remarks, I feel like we're all preaching to the choir because we recognize this, and yet there's a disconnect.
Sure. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I agree as well, and I think Karen pointed out this example of cars and how many times they cross both borders before they're fully assembled, and I think it's more useful to focus on the integration of that rather than on deficits on specific parts of a relationship. So I would agree with Karen. But.
Yeah, and also I think everyone agrees that NAFTA makes North America more competitive. I was looking the other day at a video of what China is doing with respect to building infrastructure all around Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Middle East, and North Africa to have access to all those resources that can come from there, but also it's kind of a strategy to develop markets for their own exports. So while China is doing that, here in North America, we are discussing if it is good for us to have a natural free trade agreement. I think those are two kind of opposing views of how to compete globally. And I think, NAFTA will provide precisely that for North America.
I feel like it's covered.
Okay, so I wanted to go back and sort of understand why is it that we say that in the previous NAFTA agreement, the existing NAFTA agreement, energy was sort of not in the center of it. Was it because at the time Mexico basically had a closed energy sector, or what other reasons? Why they never develop an energy chapter, or was at the center of the agreement?
So I guess that goes to me too. So during NAFTA 1.0, there were really two sacred cows. It was immigration and energy. Politically, it was probably as explosive to address the free flow of labor as it was to address the free flow of energy. That said, it took a quarter of a century since then to really get to where we are now, which is the constitutional reforms and the advances in technology that allow you to tap into energy resources that were unthinkable years ago. NAFTA did address parts of the energy, and Sempra was, groundbreaking in that aspect. And as a matter of fact, it quickly showed the positive results of the sector, because I remember, just by memory, we had a phase in or a phase out of the energy tariff for natural gas, which, if my memory serves me right, I think we accelerated that the elimination of that 6% duty. So it was addressed in certain parts and components, and certainly, derivados de petróleo. How do we say that?
Refined products, yeah.
Right. Was also, and so hence we have, a very strong and also collaborative relationship across North America among our chemical industry associations. And they've also have been very vocal in terms of the need to modernize, but to preserve.
Anyone, you want to?
Well, in terms of the existing agreement, like Chapter 6 is pretty basic, and as it was negotiated, there were no issue with exemptions, of which Mexico had some very key ones. And as I understand it, countries had also just been through the GATT process, okay. And there wasn't I don't know if there was the appetite to tackle energy in the NAFTA 1.0, and it does. There's even an element that only applies to the United States and Canada, which sounds like it guarantees U.S. supply of Canadian petroleum, and that's still debated by legal experts and parliamentarians in Canada as to what that means, and does it guarantee the mistake of oil, and so that was controversial to a certain degree, but it was something that was included for the two countries.
Okay. Anyone? Yes.
The one thing that I would add from NAFTA 1.0 is that even though there were many exemptions for Mexico carved out of the energy chapter, is NAFTA 1.0 did include what is referred to as a ratchet, and for foreign investment. And what it did was it gave NAFTA protections to U.S. and Canadian investors as Mexico opened private investment. Okay. And these protections apply to energy investments, whether they were made before or after the the reforms. And this ratchet protection was very important for Sempra as we grew and expanded in Mexico. So it was an avenue for NAFTA protections in energy even before the recent reforms.
So basically, as the sector opened,
as the government was willing to allow the investment protection, then the ratchet allowed full NAFTA benefits to cover those investments.
Okay. Any comment on it?
Yes, I wanna mention that. I mean, growing in Mexico, I think one of the reasons why the Mexican government decided not to include energy in the NAFTA was because of the way Mexicans are educated. I think you grow under the values. I mean, even in primary school, you are educated under the values that oil and gas belong to Mexicans. And just remember that. When the NAFTA came into effect in 1994, some years after, even the decade after, before, Mexico was going through a huge economic crisis. The 1982 debt crisis that carry on along the 80s. So when Carlos Salinas became president, he initiated a series of aggressive reforms. The culmination of those reforms was actually NAFTA. And for many Mexicans, seeing for investment in energy, or creating competition for Pemex was something that not imaginable. I mean, it was very difficult to think about that back in those years. And also, it was even in the kind of corporate image of Pemex. The slogan back then was like the pride and strength of Mexico. So we Mexicans grew with under the values that oil and gas belong to Mexicans, and that's I think one of the political reasons that the government took into account when negotiating NAFTA 1.0.
By the way, that's I think that's a very important point, and it's not only in Mexico. In a lot of oil exporting countries, this is a very typical perception, and it's hard to open up the sector in many of these countries, and the typical thing is that they don't want to do it, they have to do it. It's when they need to, because either production is collapsing or reserves are down or the investments needed are in high risk areas and require very significant investment, is typically when this type of countries open up, and so Mexico is not different than others in that. I wanted to move on. I mean, you all of you mentioned a little bit about how the landscape changed in the last 2.5 decades. But I wanted to go into a little bit more detail in the different sort of aspects. For example, in electricity, how is the integration? How much has happened and how much has changed with the opening up of the reform in Mexico? In natural gas, Adrian, to elaborate a little bit more in how you mentioned about how the exponential growth in export, but and also with Canada, how so I don't know who wants to maybe start. Maybe Aaron?
Maybe we'll work our way down, maybe. Obviously, the gas story with Mexico is a huge development, but we're actually seeing that market dynamics changing with the U.S. and Canada as well. Canada has traditionally been a net exporter of gas to the United States, but obviously with the boom happening here, that dynamic is changing as we speak, and particularly with Marcellus and Utica gas making its way to the Canadian Northeast, and that's been a significant development that looks to probably continue in that direction. Obviously, the oil sands story is a big one for Canada, and that's taken place alongside NAFTA in terms of the amount of crude we're now exporting to the United States. One thing that I guess that's changed in most recent years for the United States is with the lifting of the crude export ban. You're now seeing U.S. crude reaching more and more countries. I mean, Canada is, the last monthly report I saw, Canada is still the top destination, but China is certainly in the number 2 spot now. And I think it's also I think another aspect that has changed maybe since NAFTA's first entered into force is on the regulatory side. There's the regulatory picture in all three countries has changed significantly in terms of aspects to consider in the regulatory permitting of a project. So I would say it's more important than ever that we have something such as the NAFTA, where it can act as an umbrella for us to coordinate and cooperate on energy regulation. Because not unrelated to that, something else that's probably changed is doing pipeline projects is really hard now. You can certainly look north of the border to us right now in the western part of the country, but we saw this with XL here and with DAPL. These are getting there's a lot of stakeholders. They're not easy projects, but if we have NAFTA as a way to sort of, at least for the governments, to sort of commit to working together on cross-border infrastructure, it's a good thing.
Thanks. Adrián or Mariam?
I think you're our resident expert on the cross-border, but I guess I would say the one thing I would add, in addition to what's been mentioned, is reliability. So we have a lot of cross-border transmission with Canada, and I think that's well established, and that really helps for grid stability with those states that border in Canada. And I think that we have seen a little bit of growth, definitely growth in the same cross-border transmission with Mexico. I'll say Sempra, we're a San Diego-based company, and one of our subsidiaries is San Diego Gas and Electric. And there is a cross-border transmission line that Sempra built that has been very important in California. It goes both ways. It's been very important in California to help us prevent significant reliability problems. And I think that us being more integrated in that way is helpful to all three sides. And I think that this electric reliability aspect is maybe something that gets a little less attention. And I think it's something definitely to be aware of in the energy sphere.
You want Adrián to?
Yeah, I just want to mention that, for example, I think both countries or companies on both sides of the border, in the case of Mexico and the U.S., are aware of how important infrastructure along the border is, and also energy trade. And for example, as Mexico is a free trade agreement, natural gas exports, they don't face that much red tape. But without NAFTA, and probably you're going to be here, you're going to agree with that, is that, for example, without NAFTA, exporting natural gas to Mexico, the U.S. company will need to have a presidential permit.
Heightened standard of review.
Yeah.
Public interest test.
Yeah, and that may take months to get. And probably that's going to complicate, this kind of, the flow of natural gas from the U.S. to Mexico. And that's something we need to take into account when, for the negotiators.
So just very basically from what I'm hearing, because I am not an energy expert, is obviously this high interdependence that we have in the sector that really works across the entire region, and as I'm hearing you say it and I reflect on it, and how for granted it's taken, because it's kind of like it's the infrastructure. People really don't think about the infrastructure until something goes south.
Not working.
Exactly.
Right? Sour, right. So I'm thinking, as you go and speak to people and you engage, and again, I'm making this call out to all of you, it's North American integration in the energy sector is what's keeping our lights on and making us competitive. And I think that's, it's something that we all got to get better educated.
Agreed.
I wanted to Karen covered a little bit, but I wanted to see if we can discuss a little bit more. What are the points of contention that we have right now in terms of, what are the gaps that have to be closed between the three countries? And of course, in general, and if in particular, which ones affect the energy sector? I don't know, Karen, if you can start with.
So look, the United States, Mexico, and Canada had been working to modernize NAFTA for a long while. I think that we all saw TPP as the vehicle to do this because the world economy changed, and it was important for us to address issues that were not even existing in when we were negotiating NAFTA. Once President Trump took office and laid out his agenda, I think what we ended up doing was looking at the U.S. proposals and established about 5 buckets of where we saw them. So there's what we call, the presidential priorities, which is the deficit and the America First agenda. That speaks really to the rules of origin, and specifically in a very particular sector, which is the automotive sector, and very much tied to the steel sector and the growth of the steel industry. And so in that specific chapter, what you have seen is the U.S. come out with a very aggressive proposal. Their initial proposal called for something of an 85% rule of origin for regional value content for the vehicle to qualify as being North American produced. The current RVC is at 62.5. Mexico, Canada, and the United States have a very integrated auto market, and as I explained earlier. And when we were negotiating TPP, actually the U.S. had proposed a much laxer rule of origin. So there's a 180-degree shift in what was being addressed 3-4 years ago to what is being tabled today. In addition to this 85% RVC, the original proposal called for 50% U.S. domestic content. Now that runs completely counter to any concept of what a free trade agreement is looking to do. That proposal has now been modified, but we're still looking at a high RVC and a layer upon layer of hurdles that companies have to meet in order for them to qualify. And so, as Miriam had said, and I probably mispronounced your name earlier, if companies do not consider the agreement to be good for their business, because at the end of the day, business is in the business of doing business, then they won't use it. So there's little incentive for us to come to an agreement to something that is unworkable. So we're still stuck there. There's been back and forth conversations on it. Canada has presented a new proposal or new elements where we're looking at just to how do you take into account R&D, how do we actually modify the rule of origin to reflect what a car is today, which is very different than what it was 30 years ago. So that's one of them. Does somebody want to add, or I can just keep going, whatever you want.
I mean, I think, there's like, we see sort of you have the issues that fall under sort of updating the agreement to reflect a 21st century economy. That would be sort of the digital commerce and updating trade promotion and facilitation, and those are the easy ones. Those are the ones where we've made a lot of progress. Then you have the issues where parties are seeking commitments beyond the current NAFTA. That would include things like increased commitments on temporary entry and also intellectual property. And those are more sensitive discussions, and they always have been. And then you have sort of the issues which we see as sort of NAFTA minus, or stepping backwards, and that would include the autos, that would include the sunset, and that would include the U.S. proposal not to have any dispute settlement chapters, and that's where as you said it gets really tough.
And then particularly for the energy sector, as has been mentioned, dispute settlement is a critical element. But I'd also point out the government procurement chapter. So So the U.S. proposal is something of a dollar for dollar. Now, let's be real. Let's take into context the difference in the sizes of our economies, and the fact that U.S. businesses are probably the largest beneficiaries of government procurement across the board. Full stop. Period. So there's this perception that the agreement has not been fair or balanced. And I think the reality speaks differently. So that would be another point.
And I think that's a gap in the negotiations, highlighting the positives of NAFTA. I mean, it could be a communication issue because NAFTA provides, the institutional framework for protecting investments. And also one of the issues that we may highlight is the fact that Mexico is becoming, bit by bit, an important export market for U.S. energy commodities. As you were mentioning earlier, since 2015, Mexico, is buying more energy commodities than it sells to the U.S. And that is the outcome not only of the energy reform. For many years, even decades, Pemex, for example, was financing the Mexican budget, like between 30 and 40% of the Mexican budget was financed by Pemex. So because of that, investment didn't occur in all those energy commodity areas that now we are importing from the U.S. So the fact that Mexico is the largest energy, the export market for natural gas, petrochemicals, and diesel and gasoline has to do with the energy reform, but also with the fact that years before that the Mexican government didn't invest in those areas.
I think one of the most contentious issues that we've talked about, but to give the perspective on business, is investment protection. The energy industry is very pleased that there's a lot of progress towards an energy chapter that would lock in the current level of openness. But I think that it's the energy business's view that a modernized energy chapter that does not include investment protection, it really doesn't have the value. It's been reported that President Trump is looking for in the wins that he gets in NAFTA, that he's looking for an energy win. And I think that it would be the view of the energy business that an energy chapter that doesn't include investment protection broadly for business is, you really aren't getting the energy win. It's kind of like butter without bread. You have to have one together with the other. And I think that it definitely is something that's very contentious. One thing that we haven't talked about is the tension that the administration is having with Capitol Hill on this very point. And I think that it's important to remember that interstate commerce and foreign commerce ultimately, constitutionally, under the U.S. Constitution, rests with the Congress. And Congress is pushing back in a significant way on the administration on this issue, and we see that as a very positive thing. About 3-4 weeks ago, the Hill, led by Chairman Brady, 100 members and senators sent a letter to Ambassador Lighthizer basically saying that if you send NAFTA without investment protection, we don't know if you have the votes. And that's a pretty significant statement for members of Congress to make to the administration. And when Ambassador Lighthizer testified the day that letter was issued to the Committee on Ways and Means, it was the first point that Chairman Brady of Texas, brought up to Ambassador Lighthizer. I want to make sure that you saw my letter. And Ambassador Lighthizer acknowledged that he saw the letter. And Ambassador Lighthizer also said, I think one of the most important things investment protection has going for it is how much you support it, sir. And so I think that that's an important part in the dynamic that we're going through here in the U.S. And I think the engagement of Capitol Hill on that critical issue, you're going to see more and more of that as we try to get to finalization of the agreement.
On that issue, investment protection for the energy sector, it's so crucial in the sense that, this is a sector in which investments sometimes are, 40-year, 50-year investments. They take a long time of maturing, and of course the political cycles in countries, etc., create a lot of uncertainty, and we have seen, in particular in the rest of Latin America, these cycles of changing rules and some sort of expropriation, etc., that are, I think, a big issue of concern. So I think for the development of the energy sector, in particularly in Mexico in the future, these are absolutely central elements. So my one question would be, what exactly are the investment protections now, if taking NAFTA 1.0, and what would be the ones that you would consider the most reasonable to have? And the other question is it an alternative to, Mexico is announcing that they are getting into the ICSID treaty, sort of the World Bank dispute settlement system, and they do have, for example, bilateral treaties with the Netherlands. Would that be an alternative to the dispute resolution mechanism in NAFTA, or why not?
Good question. I'll take the first crack at that. So as far as the investment protections, there are several. The first is non-discriminatory treatment. And this is the idea that an investor would have treatment no less favorable than the government would afford its own domestic investors. Second relates to expropriation. It's the idea, and I think you spoke to this, Francisco, the idea that there is an obligation by the host country to provide prompt and adequate compensation for both physical and regulatory takings. Third is minimum standards of treatment. That's really a matter of, I think to put it succinctly, a matter of the government acting in good faith. There is free transfers of capital, just cash flow back and forth, cross-border. And maybe this ties to the government contracts issue, but prohibition on performance requirements. So a requirement that local goods have to be bought as part of your investments. And then last and most importantly, not to beat a dead horse, but the ability for investors to be able to bring those claims for international arbitration and get money damages. These are the substantive rights investors currently have under NAFTA. Okay. It is what we would hope to be able to continue to have in NAFTA 2.0. As far as the ICSID issue, ICSID is a procedural tool. And so it is not the substantive rights. The substantive rights are in NAFTA. And this is what we're looking to preserve going forward. ICSID is one possible procedural path if you are in the place of trying to get a remedy of using those procedural tools, but it definitely doesn't solve the problem.
Okay. Anyone else?
So in addition to, I guess the protections that are clearly outlined, and you did a really good job, is you add most favored nation treatment.
Yes,
so
absolutely.
You should be treated as well as your most favored nation. And you've got national treatment. So there's a non-discriminatory international treatment. It forces you to treat you as an equal. Now, what we have said at this point, given the lack of progress, is if the United States doesn't want to be part of this, then Canada and Mexico will go at it alone. Because we strongly believe that there are principles that should be enshrined. Mexico has a very wide network of free trade agreement, and we've negotiated similar provisions in our free trade agreement with the European Union and with the NAFTA countries, or we have bilateral investment treaties that address this. We have similar provisions in what we've done with our partners throughout Central and South America. We have a free trade agreement with Israel and with Japan. So we're not sitting idly. As far as, and linked to, because you mentioned that these investments are generational investments. Mm-hmm. When you think about the sudden death clause, which is, and let me explain to you a little bit of what the rationale behind the U.S. proposal is that there should be a mechanism to review what works in the agreement and to terminate it, and that we should recommit to that, to getting married all over again every 5 years. Now, look, I got married. I've been married almost 22 years, and if I were going to have to think about having children, but having to recommit every 5 years, I think the outcome would be different. You cannot make generational investments if they're going to be, if there's the risk is so high. When you, and what Canada and Mexico have come back and said is, yes, we agree to the fact that there should be a strong and, if needed, independent and thorough review of what is working, and that we should have recommendations, and we can decide on whether we make them binding or not binding, or how do we move forward once we do this. And we can do it every 5 years. That's fine. But if you want to walk out of the agreement, that provision already exists, and that's what's called Article 2205 in the current NAFTA agreement, which almost a year ago the president was very close to invoking, and we called it Black Wednesday. I was speaking to somebody earlier today about how we all felt and acted at that point. We take the threat of withdrawal very seriously, but at the end of the day, that is a unilateral decision. That's the first part of that article says a country may withdraw upon given 6 months' notice. The second clause of that article says, and the agreement will remain in place for the other two. So those two are very important because nobody is asking you to renounce your sovereignty, but your decision to leave does not make it automatic that I divorce from my cousin North. Right?
Go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, and I mean, I think for Canada and ISDS, I mean, it's a part of all of our FT. That's what it's always included. You need only to look at our the Canada EU trade agreement, and that to get an idea of what we're looking for. I think back in February there was a rumor that got out that may have even resulted in a Reuters article. Anyway, that we were Canada was okay with moving ahead. And just with no ISDS, absolutely not the case. We have, our position of a comprehensive investment chapter. It's the position we had last fall, and it remains the position we had today. And as Karen said, if the U.S., the U.S. has been public about, about preference to opt out, which we would see as rendering it meaningless. So we're going to. If we need to, we will move forward and with Mexico.
The rumor created quite the brouhaha for the business community.
It did, yeah, absolutely. A lot of phones ringing in the embassy for sure. So I was glad that Minister Freeland's office quickly issued a clarifying statement. Yeah, and it's funny, Karen. You mentioned the Black Wednesday. I've been in.
I was going to ask what you call is Black Wednesday. Is that what we call it?
Yeah,
it was a Wednesday.
It was,
yeah.
And I think it was either April 17 or 20. That was. I mean, somebody has to look at what this week and when Wednesday last year.
It was dark.
Anyway, for me, as only I've been in DC for just over a year and a half, and that day was very educational in seeing how DC works when it needs to work, and the phone network that lit up was incredible. It was quite a day. Yeah.
It seems to me that these two issues, the sunset clause and the dispute and investor protection mechanisms, are so important for the energy sector that if those two things are, if either the sunset clause is put in or there is no, all the benefits of almost of that. I wouldn't say all, but a significant chunk of what is relevant for the energy investors, will not be there, and so it will be a shame. One question I wanted to ask now that all of a sudden the president mentioned TPP again, and so how does TPP play in this story? Is this something that we can seriously think about? How is TPP proceeding without the U.S. and what are the implications? And moreover, why I don't think in TPP there is an energy chapter. So what would be the difference there? And so
So from Mexico's perspective, I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce what the Canadians renamed it, so we call it TPP 11. There are too many T's and P's. Exactly. We have presented to our Senate just in the last weeks. We are in full consultations, and with the Senate. The Senate is the body that approves this, as throughout the entire negotiating process. And really, since NAFTA, the government of Mexico engages in a very thorough and robust consultation process, both with the business stakeholders, with academia, and with our Congress. So this is not a surprise to them. We might have an approval of TPP 11 by the end of the month. What does it say about NAFTA? So I think that by and large, it incorporates the 21st century disciplines that we're looking for. It has a revision to the investor state provisions to keep it modernized. Let's be real. In the last quarter of a century, we've also worked through revisions within the NAFTA to update it. There is not a specific chapter, I believe, on energy, but there is a specific way to address SOEs and SOE behavior. So as we were discussing earlier, our approach in the NAFTA is to create this hybrid where we're dealing with whatever is specific and central to North American energy sector is going to be reflected in that chapter. And the other issues are across the board. I would say to the U.S., when we heard this, the president musing over whether or not they'd want to come back. The thought, the song that popped up in my head was, "Baby, come back." Look, the reality is TPP was an instrument to bridge the Americas with the largest, most dynamic, growing region of the world. It was envisioned as an agreement of like-minded countries to promote shared prosperity and growth across the globe. And to be perfectly honest, to present as a counterweight to a growing economic power that may or may not have the same set of rules or thoughts with how you live in a rule-based system. Right now, the coin is up in the air as to who is the responsible rule-abiding player. I did not say that.
Aaron.
Another song could be "Don't Know What You've Got Till It's Gone." So yeah, we what we've referred to as the CPTPP, or the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on the Trans-Pacific Partnership. We're also in the process of advancing this. It contains a number of what we're calling suspensions from the TPP, which has allowed it to move forward. And I think from our perspective, we welcome the interest of other countries, including the United States, if they're willing and able to meet the what we see as ambitious rules and market access provisions contained in it. It is a different agreement than the TPP. As I understand it, and Karen, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the TPP, for the TPP to advance, you would need 6 countries ratifying, representing 85% of GDP.
Correct.
Which is and out of those suspensions in this modified agreement, there were some significant areas there. And as for energy, I think we have certainly here in North America, we have energy interests with some of the TPP countries and markets that we're interested in, but it's not. It doesn't, it's not this unbelievable North American energy relationship that's becoming more and more integrated that we've just been describing, and that is a big difference, and that's a relationship that bears recognizing specifically in NAFTA.
Yeah, and for Mexico in particular, it could be the source or the avenue to kind of diversify their markets, but not only export markets, but also import markets. So without, a complicated scenario here with respect to NAFTA, the TPP could be it can provide the suppliers of the energy commodities that, are more complicated to buy from the U.S. in the case of not having a NAFTA.
You want any comment?
I think it's covered. I think in our view, what matters most is that the trade agreement provide for free trade of energy, goods, and services, and investment protection and cross-border infrastructure regulatory reforms, whether it's in a specific energy chapter or more broadly through the agreement. We leave to the experts that are negotiating the agreement. It does make sense in NAFTA because there's already an energy chapter there to build on it. So.
Yeah, probably for the sector.
Right, either approach can work, but it makes sense with NAFTA that there's already an energy chapter just to build on that as it sounds as though they are doing.
Before opening up to the to questions from the audience, I wanted to ask, in terms of the timing of the negotiations, we are hearing recently the idea that it's just in a few weeks something could happen, but on the other hand, I'm hearing that it's not the full agreement, but what is it? What is happening in the next few weeks? And then, of course, about the timing of the Mexican election. Adrian mentioned that there is going to be a contentious election with a candidate that has different ideas about how the energy reform should proceed or not. I wonder, Adrian, by the way, what specifically the candidate López Obrador has said about NAFTA, the renegotiation, if he has said anything about it, what is his position, and what happens with the timing of the Mexican election, because the elections are in July, right? And then the new president doesn't take his term doesn't start until December. So how does that affect the negotiations? Anyone can.
I think he doesn't have said that much about the NAFTA renegotiations. What I know is that he kind of is confident with respect to the negotiating team that Mexico has put in place.
So as I tried to say earlier in my remarks and got a little tongue-twisted, it is the substance that drives the timing of the negotiations and not the timing. That said, we are under we're on gear 5, full steam ahead. And why is that? Because most of the issues that are near completion have been issues that we have looked at for quite a while. And the remaining ones are really hard and political, and will require burden sharing across the board. So in order for us to get to yes, there's got to be a win for us as well. We can't. Mexico is a different country today than it was 30 years ago. It is, believe it or not, a full-fledged democracy where our Senate will not just take up anything we come back with. So it's got to be something that meets the test. As we're looking to get to the win-win-win, because Mexico clearly believes that one of the essential elements is this is a trilateral agreement. There have been many rumors about bilateralizing it and having, an agreement with Mexico and then an agreement with Canada. No, the way that North America's competitiveness works is only by working together. So we will not take an agreement to our Senate if it's not a trilateral agreement. We also believe that it has to be substantively contributing to North America's competitiveness. And I think in that sense, this sector that we're discussing here today is critical. Ministers, you might have read the Geek Trade Press this morning. If not, I'll give you the highlight, is my minister will be in town tomorrow, in Washington, meeting with Lighthizer. Not sure whether Minister Freeland is there or not. I'm trying to remember. But look, the pressure is on. And the reality is the longer we drag this out, it's just the longer the uncertainty is there. So in order for you all that are business people to make the commitments and prepare, many companies that, have have their fiscal returns at the end of June. Others have already filed it, at the end of the year. We would like to give certainty to the markets, and that's important. And bilaterally, NAFTA really did become the backbone of our relationships. So the close collaboration that we have it really hinges on a successful NAFTA. And when I think back on it, and I've been living in Washington for the longest period in my life consecutively, so I was there in 2001. And I remember how quickly we reacted and worked in concert with U.S. Customs and Border Patrol to shut down the borders and provide all the support we could. I remember 2005 in Katrina, where for the first time in over 100 years, Mexican military crossed in full uniform carrying cement bags to go help rebuild New Orleans and Louisiana. And more recently, our close collaboration on other issues helped thwart an assassination attempt of a Saudi Arabian ambassador in Washington, D.C. And like that, there are multiple examples. When the plane in Mexico fell with our then Secretary of Homeland Security, the equivalent, it was within minutes that we were able to get the Transportation Secretary from Mexico with the Transportation Secretary of the United States on the telephone and have NTSB in Mexico within 4 hours to help analyze the crash. So the cooperation is very deep. There's a lot of things that we don't see. We all want that to continue and grow.
Neil, do you wanna?
Yeah, and I think Karen's comment about the substance is a really important one in terms of how you look at it, and perhaps more useful than it could be finalized by X date, or it's more to look at what's left, and there's a lot of work left in some sensitive areas, and but at the same time our teams are in DC, and they've been in DC for a while, and they're kind of camped out. So I know this because my boardroom reservations at the embassy keep getting canceled because the negotiators need them. But yeah, our teams are there, and they're working really hard, and they're going to keep working.
I want to open now to the audience, and I will take first 3 questions in group of 3 questions. So first, please introduce yourself, and a question is a short statement with a question mark at the end. Please let's keep it that way is possible. Yes, sir, please.
Hi, I'm Mark Sokolow. My question is, what I like to see or if you comment on is the projections. So when NAFTA was originally negotiated, what were the projections for the different business sectors, whether it's auto or whatever, and then you compare it now, what's the projections when you negotiate for the different business sectors? Because obviously President Trump is thinking, at least in terms of the auto sector, that the United States lost out. And so that's my question, is to comment on the different projections in terms of the business.
We'll take 2 more, yes.
So there's a lot of talk about trade agreements. I think we all agree that overall they're beneficial for the population, but there's certain parts of the population in each country that are heavily affected by it, and the same thing with Brexit and another trade agreements. So is there any talk in the current negotiation to address the losers to compensate the losers, so that would tend to be a big majority and they're louder? Is there any talk about that, which is something that I believe it was not addressed in the first time around?
One more, yes.
Well, my question is kind of related to that. Currently, we have a winner-loser mentality. The negotiators that are on the table from the 3 countries, what is the general attitude of the representatives of the U.S. part of the negotiating table? Are they carrying that message of winning, losing, best case, worst case scenario?
Who wants to start?
Happy to go. Just briefly on NAFTA projections, and then we'll get into the zero-sum questions, if that makes sense. So what was NAFTA negotiated? What were the metrics of success when at least the government of Mexico was negotiating NAFTA in the early 90s? It was really to increase trade and investment across the region. Those were the two main metrics. And I briefly touched up on the third, which was the intangible, which really I think is super important, which is the building of institutions that are transparent and accountable, because they feed into the first and the second. And by all measurements, we exceeded expectations in terms of how much trade, our trade multiplied by 7, and investment in Mexico and across North America has clearly boomed. I mean, Texas is one of the clearest examples. Today, Texas is an auto manufacturing state. I mean, it's not only the capital of energy in the world, but it is an electronics producer worldwide. So in terms of, for instance, in sectors, automobile production increased in Mexico by 1 million cars, in the United States by 1 million cars, and I don't have the number for Canada, but I can look it up. So it has grown, and I can also point you to our NAFTA website, naftamexico.net, where you can, it's interactive, and you can scroll and look at the evolution of trade, and either by sector or by state, and it will unfold you with a wealth of information. But I'm happy to get more detail for you if that's very important to you. In terms of the zero-sum mentality, as we're looking at it, that's not where we come from. We come from let's grow the pie. It's not about splitting it. Now, let's look at some factors that have come into play that feed into this economic anxiety. Clearly, NAFTA coincided with the technological revolution that we did not envision. We negotiated NAFTA via fax. How many of you continue to receive fax? Please raise your hand. I mean, the automation and technological innovation has clearly dislocated many. The entry of China into the WTO was another shift. And 9/11, believe it or not, also played into bringing the United States from an expansion of its economy to a significant shock. And of course, then we had the 2008 economic crisis as well. Those factors play a significant role into the economic anxiety that is felt by many across the board. That is real. The diagnosis is wrong. And the cure is not to close our markets. It is not to look inward and to look at specific ways of sheltering ourselves out. So how do we address that is about how do we establish the public policy issues that can address or that can help those segments of the population meet the demands that the 21st century economy needs. I don't know how many of you actually watched Mike Zuckerberg when he was testifying before Congress last week. The reality is it's an entirely different economy today, and the members of the Senate don't have a real understanding of how Facebook works.
They're the same members.
And the reason why I point to this is we need to prepare our workforce, the one that's being left behind, but also the one that's coming up, to meet those challenges. And you cannot ask trade to do that. Trade is one tool in a toolbox. So unfortunately, the world has moved way much more quickly than our ability to establish those policies in place. So I would say, yes, let's invest in education. Yes, let's invest in capacity building and retraining programs. Yes, let's look at how can we deepen integration. And yes, let's invest in our infrastructure, because infrastructure, whether it's energy or construction, will make us richer and better.
Well, you answered that very well, Karen. So I'll just, in terms of projections, that it makes me think of temporary entry, and yes, as I mentioned earlier, it's a sensitive area, but that's one thing where if we look back to when NAFTA entered into force, there's categories of labor that were non-existent. If we're looking at cloud computing and the like, and these are things that I think we're projecting are going to increase, and hopeful to be able to address in modernizing the agreement. But again, as I said, temporary entry has been a tougher one. In terms of affected populations, this is my opportunity, I guess, to plug Canada's progressive trade agenda. We've proposed both Indigenous and gender chapters. We'll see how we do on those, but it's something that, again, if you look at recent FTAs, we concluded an FTA with Chile that had those aspects. In terms of gender, it's recognizing and affirming that opportunities need to be provided for women to take advantage of the economic growth that's going to take place under this FTA, and having the governments commit to implementing gender equality policies across the chapters, and similarly for Indigenous peoples, recognizing their importance and ensuring they have opportunities to take advantage of under the agreement. So yeah, that's I'll leave it at that.
And with respect to energy, for example, NAFTA may facilitate trade, but there are some conditions in Mexico that are going to play a role in, increasing flows of energy trade between Mexico and the U.S., like investment, all these different auctions with respect to oil and gas. Investment is coming up, but production is going to kind of increase in the medium and long term, and not only for oil, but also for natural gas. I think Mexico will continue to buy more energy commodities from the U.S., and that, the conditions in Mexico are what's going to drive, the energy trade between the two countries.
The one thing I would add on the energy and the projections, I don't have the benefit of what any projections would have been at that time, but I think that you can imagine it, right? With Canada, they were saying at that time that their oil production had peaked, under the peak oil theory of production, which we've learned was not the case with the oil sands. And then Mexico, obviously, as we've discussed today, at that time had carved itself out of the energy chapter. And the U.S. did not have the kind of gas demand that we have now, because natural gas wasn't present in the power sector the way it is now, right? But I think now, at least as it relates to Mexico, numbers that we've seen is the opportunity for as much as $40 billion in energy infrastructure investment in Mexico, and that is without exploration and production. That's not even including the many billions, tens of billions that would be involved there. So I think if we were to, it's a very good question. I think if you were going to do a look back, there would be a stark difference between what the thought would be on what was going to be and what ended up happening, and the opportunity is very significant now.
Let me take a few more questions. Yes.
I'm Eric Shaw. This may seem like a basic question, but I've just missed it. Why is the administration against investment protection? What is the rationale that they give?
Let's take a few and yes.
Right. My name is Marco. The question is about more relative on tariff. Mexico have considered implement tariff to foreign goods, for example, steel, automotive, that goes from foreign countries through United States to protect their own domestic, domestic production.
Two more. Yes.
So if you could kind of rewind 9 years and say that the envisioned energy provisions were in place, would Keystone have played out differently, and would the role of the State Department have been different? Just going to give a framework for going forward, what might be different under that kind of framework.
On this regard with the chapters on adding women and indigenous debates under NAFTA, is there any provision, or are you foreseeing the resolution of controversies with all these issues that are happening with the energy sector, infrastructure, and indigenous outbreaks that have been going on in Mexico, particularly recently?
Yeah.
All this U.S. companies trying to get into indigenous territories and stuff. So, is there any provision for a resolution of controversies about this kind of issue under NAFTA?
So, anyone who wants to answer this, and of course, this will be the last, because we are finishing our time. So, maybe Karen, we can start with you.
Okay. So let's go. I'll do as quickly as possible. Regarding ISDS, there is. What's the best way of putting it? What I understand, Ambassador Lighthizer, who is the USTR, believes and shares of the opinion is that it is an infringement on U.S. sovereignty, that it cedes to an independent body the ability to review decisions that are made by the administration. So clearly, this was a hot topic when we were negotiating NAFTA 1.0, and in Mexico you had a provision called Cláusula Calvo, and whether it would run contrary to our constitution at the time. So one aspect is whether you're ceding that, and the second aspect is if you're giving foreign nationals a better standard of treatment than your own nationals, because your national constituency is not going to take you to an independent court. It will seek remedy through the U.S. courts. From our perspective, that's not necessarily a true premise. There is no surrendering of your national sovereignty. What you are agreeing is to the terms and conditions if a dispute were to come about as to how do they get addressed and who are the independent experts that can review what you've done. In terms of the second provision is we are giving each other nationals the same treatment. So if I am providing Canadians the ability to use this mechanism, then Mexicans in Canada will have that option as well. When you establish an agreement, when you get married, you obviously give up certain rights, like more likely than not, you give up the right to be promiscuous in exchange for benefits. And so that's the balance. And so that's just like the most basic way that I can think of explaining ISDS. Let me be clear. The United States has not lost one case in the 25 years of existence of this chapter. I will also add, of all the cases that I have seen, not one is related to manufacturing. They are generally an instrument for either service providers. For me, Karen, that grew up in half of my life, I lived in a Mexico that was living through recurrent economic crises. The other half of my life, I have seen a stable albeit slowly growing, Mexico. ISDS is a mechanism that introduces transparency and accountability across the government and at multiple levels. So I consider it to be important, but this decision is for the US. On tariffs and steel production, I'm not entirely sure what you're saying. If you are talking with regards to China overcapacity, we are addressing those through anti-dumping and subsidy duties that are in place. If you're talking about something else, you can probably, just for sake of time, find me later and we can talk more about it. We do work trilaterally to address overcapacity in steel, and particularly in something called the North American Steel Committee, both Canada, US, and Mexico, and we also work together to address these issues at the OECD. On Keystone, I'm not going to comment. And on gender and the indigenous, I mean, these are new chapters. We're looking into them. They're being negotiated. And that's about as far as I'm going to take it for now.
Aaron, yes.
Yeah, and I think Karen covered USTR and ISDS quite well. I would depending on what you read, and we read reams and reams of this stuff in DC, but part of a bipartisan strategy for the agreement. There would be, and you would have significant ISDS critics on the Democrat side. So that's just probably one factor that may play into the overall direction. Keystone XL. Would it have played out differently? Wow. What I would say is, presidential permitting authority is a powerful tool. We've now seen it deployed twice on the same project and given different results with the same environmental assessment. So I don't know that we would be in a situation where presidential permitting authority would be going anywhere. I think, though, in terms of cross-border, promoting cross-border infrastructure, it would be looking at the areas where we can better align, and there are a whole myriad of things to get projects done. But would it have played out differently? I mean, I don't know. It's still playing out, right? It's, I think we're at this point, we've always been of the position that we supported the project, and that carried over from two different political parties in Canada, actually. And I think now we see it heading in a positive direction. There are some court cases playing out, but we're feeling good about Keystone. In terms of Indigenous, as Karen said, that it is something that's currently under discussion. I think from Canada's perspective, you can look at some of the efforts that we've made in terms of our energy regulatory processes, and making better effort to incorporate what we call meaningful consultation with Indigenous tribes on energy projects, and that's certainly reflective in the energy regulatory modernization process that we're currently going through. The current government has placed a priority on Indigenous relations, and that carries through into both the areas of trade and in terms of energy regulation.
And also, I would like to mention that these conflicts between local communities or indigenous communities and companies, for example, in the Mexican energy sector, they are contemplated in the local regulations. But as we have heard recently, it's not kind of working. There are different projects being delayed because of this kind of conflict between local communities and firms. And I think you may want to add on that.
I'm not. I think that they covered it. These are tough issues. It is very important to have good relationships in where you are building your projects with your stakeholders, and we think the most important stakeholders are the direct stakeholders that live where it is that we operate, and it's very important to get to consensus and agreement there, but it's a tough issue, and I think it's a great question that you're asking, and hopefully we do get to a place where there are good reforms in NAFTA that include that. So look forward to those insights as we see what you all are agreeing to. I don't know that I have anything further to add, except I might add on the investment protection point, just building on the point that Karen made, because Ambassador Lighthizer has the two arguments, the sovereignty one, and then the issue of giving U.S. rule of law type principles to investments in these other countries. And, his argument, as Karen said, is really that, well, if you give this rule of law to these other countries, then you're incentivizing an investment that could have been in the U.S. and you're incentivizing it to go to Mexico or Canada instead. And I think what the energy sector would say and what Sempra would say is that we have to go where the resources and the consumers are. This is not a matter of infrastructure that could have been in the U.S. We are providing natural gas, electricity, and other energy services to Mexicans in Mexico, and we have to go where the resources are and where the consumers are. So it really disabuses that argument of his, and it's why we make a point of amplifying it, because that argument really doesn't hold water for our types of investments.
Thank you. Before closing up, I wanted to thank Michael Marr, who has been the organizer of this event with the help of the Trade Leadership Coalition. Thank you, Michael, our senior advisor to the Center for Energy Studies. And I want to thank all our speakers for this very interesting panel and discussion. And thank you all for coming to our presentation. Thank you.